Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's reading. This is an exciting one. We're really excited to have Larissa Mercado-López here with us. We are the Fresno State Creative Writing Alumni Chapter. And today's event is part of Latinx Heritage Month on campus. And we want to thank Esteban Parra from the Latino Faculty and Staff Association for including us. This reading is also in partnership with the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, where Larissa teaches, and we want to thank their faculty and staff today. Additionally, we'd like to send a shout out to Nicole, Corrine, and Donna, our friends at the Alumni Association, for their great support of this series. And of course, thank you to our Creative Writing Alumni Committee, Camila Okafor, Courtney Hughes, Steven Sanchez, Esmeralda Gamez, Gabriel Ibarra, and Mayalise Carney. We'd also like to thank Ethan Chatanye for running the Zoom room, and to, of course, Jefferson Beavers, who's our president and is going to introduce Larissa and moderate the Q&A. As a final note, before we get started here, just want to let you all know that all the proceeds for this series, both admission and donations, are split 50-50 between the chapter and the author. So really, thank you so much for zooming in today, signing up and supporting us. This chapter's part will go to our new Larry Levis Creative Writing Scholarship, which will be awarded for the first time in fall 2021. I want to welcome our president, Jefferson Beavers.
Good morning, everyone. Super excited today to be introducing Larissa Mercado-López for Fresno Writers Live. Shouts out to everyone out there. Tom, I see you there. John Bynum, Carly, everyone else in the meeting today. Thank you for coming. This is my first time getting to introduce an author and host the Q&A, and I'm really excited to do that, especially for Larissa. So what I'll do first, just read her bio and then tell you a little bit about how we came to invite her to share her work with us today. Larissa Mercado-López is a Texas native and the mother of 4 children. She's an associate professor here at Fresno State in the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. She received her doctorate in English and Latina literature from University of Texas, San Antonio, UTSA. Larissa's debut book for children, Esteban de Luna, Baby Rescuer, in Spanish, Esteban de Luna, Rescatador de bebés, was published in 2017 on the Piñata Books imprint of Arte Publico Press, and they're based in Houston. Larissa, in addition to being a wonderful bilingual children's author, is also an anthology editor with Laura Almillo and Cristina Herrera. She co-edited the anthology Voices of Resistance, Interdisciplinary Approaches to the Chicanx Children's Literature in 2017. And also with Cristina Herrera, she co-edited the anthology Remapping the Latinx Literary Landscape in 2016. And we're going to be talking a little bit about those anthologies a little bit later in this reading as well, when Larissa tells us a little bit about kind of the origins of her book and the purpose of her book and some of the experiences she's had navigating the publishing world with it. The reason that the Creative Writing Alumni Chapter invited Larissa to speak today is she is not an alumni of Fresno State. She's a faculty here. But personally, I've been so inspired by her work on this campus, not just with first-gen college students, Latinx college students, but also as a mom. And she's such a tireless advocate for parents, working parents, schooling parents on our campus. And we just thought, what a better opportunity in a time where a lot of people have their children at home. They have all these multi-levels of challenges and juggling their lives and their kids being at home for school during the pandemic. What a better time to acknowledge Larissa as a writer and to really re-celebrate her book. She had a book launch in Fresno when this book came out. It was down at Arte Americas. Some of you here may even have been at that. We wanted to give her a chance to be celebrated for her creative work as well. And in addition to being an inspiration as a mom and as a faculty, to acknowledge that, that creative work too. And so I'm very pleased today to introduce my friend and colleague, Larissa Mercado-López. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Jefferson. That was such a lovely introduction. And I feel so loved by the creative writing community at Fresno State in the English community. And that was my first, one of my first academic homes as a PhD in English. And I still try to teach as much as possible, literature and humanities texts, and so that's very much a part of my core identity as a scholar. And I don't get very many opportunities to talk about my children's book, so thank you for thinking of inviting me to do that. And before I read the book, I wanted to thank you all for being here, because I recognize that some of us are probably still reeling from the news of the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I wanted to share a couple of books that I happen to own about her. This is a children's picture book, I Dissent. And then this is part of the Who Is series about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So these are pretty widely available. You can get them online, Barnes & Noble. I think I got both of these at Barnes & Noble. Petunia's Place probably has them or can order them for you as well. So these are great, I think, for both adults and children. So if there are any children in your lives that you want to ensure that they know who Ruth Bader Ginsburg is, I highly recommend these books. Okay, so having said that, I'm now going to read my book, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it as well right after the reading, and then I will open it up to questions. Okay, so hopefully I've never read a children's book over Zoom. So feels a little wonky here, but we'll make do. So this book I will be reading in English is Esteban de Luna, Baby Rescuer. And I do want to point out the illustrations are by Alex Bartol de Lang. And I will show you illustrations up front after I read. Okay. Esteban has a cape that he wears every day. It is long and green and ripples like a flag on windy afternoons. He wears it to breakfast. He wears it to the park. He wears it to the supermarket. Oh, to the doctor's office. He even wears it to the supermarket. I tend to skip to the supermarket because that's my son's favorite illustration. He once tried wearing it to bed, but his mom put it in the washing machine. Even superheroes need to be clean, she said. Esteban loves his cape, but there is one problem. His cape cannot do anything. Esteban cannot fly. He cannot jump 3 stories high. He cannot become invisible. Sadly, he cannot even make his puppy, Chico, disappear in a puff of smoke. There is only one thing left to do: sell it. Esteban makes a sign and sits in his front yard one morning. Cape for sale, he shouts. He sits and sits and sits. No luck. Esteban's mom comes out of the house. Esteban's little sister, Lola, wriggles on his mom's back and laughs. Let's go to the park, says their mom. Parque, cheers Lola. Esteban puts his cape back on. They walk 3 blocks to the park. Esteban climbs the rock wall, goes down the slide, and heads straight to the swings. There is something on the swing, a baby doll. Esteban looks to the left, then he looks to the right. The doll is all alone. The sky suddenly becomes dark. Storm coming, vámonos, let's go, says his mom. Esteban cannot leave the doll. It will get wet and dirty. What should he do? He has an idea. Esteban wraps the doll in his cape and ties it back on. Don't worry, baby, he says, I'll save you. Raindrops plop on his head as he runs back to his mom. On the way home, he jumps over puddles and walks under the bus stop shelters to keep the baby dry. She is tied snugly against Esteban so she does not fall out. I think this is my favorite illustration of the book. When Esteban gets home, it is time for lunch. He wears the baby in his cape as he sets the table. When it is time to eat, he ties her on his back to keep her clean. All day, Esteban protects the doll in his cape. Together, they build towers, watch cartoons, and read books with his dad. Before bed, Esteban takes off his cape and puts the baby on a chair. She is dry and clean. Esteban has saved the baby. He is a superhero. He will not sell the cape after all. From now on, he announces, I am Esteban de Luna, baby rescuer. The end. And this is my son's favorite part, pointing out the fact that that's me. So I want to tell you a little bit about the book and kind of what was behind writing this book. So the story was inspired by a few things. First, it was inspired by having a son after having had 3 daughters and being really concerned about gender roles and how difficult it is to encourage gender expression in a way that's really expansive, especially in a world that insists on very rigid performances of gender, especially for boys. And this was something, of course, that I was thinking about professionally, right, as a women's studies professor. But it became even more urgent, I think, when I became a mother of a male child. So hopefully, as you notice, Esteban turns his cape into a baby wearing sling. Right? And when I was shopping around for slings shortly after I gave birth, I noticed that, I saw a lot of really cute slings that were made small for children, but it was girls that were depicted as wearing the slings. And I saw very few images of boys wearing the slings. And so, considering the fact that over 60% of boys become fathers, I thought it was problematic that we have so very few representations of boys engaged in caregiving activities. So I wanted to create a story that depicted a boy, engaged in caregiving, but that was also drawing from kind of quote unquote boy culture, right, with the superhero and the cape. So he found a way of bringing those roles and cultures and expectations together. So that was one part of my inspiration. The other part of my inspiration, so I was actually inspired by a conversation I had with a young woman at the flea market, which is the Cherry Avenue auction. A lot of you know what that is. And if you don't know what it is, it's a flea market south of Fresno that sells all kinds of wonderful produce. In fact, my husband and my son are there right now. So I was walking around with my son, and he was in this exact same sling right here, and I was carrying him. And a young Latina approached me, and she asked what it was. And she said she had never seen one of these before. And I said, it's a sling. It's called a ring sling because it has rings here. And I said I got it online. And she asked, aren't you afraid that the baby's going to fall out? And I said, no, he's pretty secure. And I showed how to adjust it. And I said, I've seen children up to 3, even 4 years old being carried around in one of these. And so she said, she goes, oh, okay. She goes, I was asking because I was looking for something for my sister. And right behind her was this even younger young woman holding, very gingerly, a baby that was probably not more than a few weeks old. And so she was walking around, she didn't have a stroller or didn't want to use it. And, I was thinking about, the experience of being postpartum and, walking around, carrying a baby, and how, your body is still in recovery, and holding a baby, in this way in your arms really puts a lot of strain on your back, on, your muscles that are still kind of recovering from birth, on some of your organs. And so these ring slings, they really help a lot to evenly distribute the weight. And so I was telling her, more about the sling, and as I was, talking, I was thinking how, the commercialization of motherhood has appropriated certain practices that have been indigenous to certain communities, all over the world for centuries, especially, women in Latin Americas. But because of how commercialized they've become, they've made these products inaccessible. And I felt kind of bad telling her where I got it from, because on that website, I don't think you can pay less than $70 for a ring sling. And these slings are, $70, you can buy a stroller for less than that amount. And so I started to think more about this, about the ways in which, motherhood culture in a way, and commercialization and capitalism has made these, indigenous practices inaccessible and even invisible to us, in the way that women of color are taught about motherhood. And at that point, I was a part of a few online baby wearing communities, and I really, like that they provide a lot of support for, mothers, and support and information about baby wearing. But I was really taken aback by the consumerism that was part of this culture, and the fervor to have the most beautiful wraps and the most beautiful slings. And I mean, some of these slings, it was like they were Air Jordans in a way. Like the more unique and the more, I guess, like, depending on the quality or the type of the actual fabric, it made them really expensive. And some of them went as high as $500 for just these long pieces of fabric that you could use to wrap your baby close to you in intricate ways. And so, I hesitate in some ways to encourage people to seek out these baby wearing communities because of that fervor, and that commercialism. I mean, some will open up their cabinets and you just see stacks and stacks and stacks of wraps that, are, it's thousands of dollars worth of inventory. So I'll just kind of wrap this up so we can get to some questions, but I just want to say that I saw the book as an opportunity to do several things. One, to begin conversations to normalize traditionally gendered roles, or traditionally gendered types of play and types of caregiving. And then I also saw it as a way of hopefully sparking interest in thinking more critically about the practice of baby wearing and thinking about the roots and the histories of the practice, and hopefully, encourage especially mothers of color to reclaim that practice and to find ways to make it accessible.
Thanks so much, Larissa. It's amazing insights into a wonderful book. I love the young boy wearing the baby on the back, and it was apparent immediately when I read it that you're poking at all sorts of things, chicanismo in particular, and how young, and you're trying to counter that. I'm curious how your son reacts to this character, because I think you had said that you were writing this book around the time that he was really young. So yeah, what do they think of the book?
Yeah, so he just started to really enjoy the book within the past year. I mean, I've been reading it to him since it was published 3 years ago. I think just the fact that, like, I have it here in my bedroom, it's the first thing he grabs, but it wasn't until maybe the past 6 months that he connected, or you really start to understand, like, the concept of what an author was and the fact that I was an author. And at one point, like, after we do this, like, our routine is we read the book, he points to my picture, I talk about the fact that I'm the author, and then I say that I wrote the book. And it's like one day it clicked and he understood what it meant, and he turned to me and he goes, "Thank you, Mom." So it was a really cute moment. And he doesn't, I don't know actually if he's really connecting with the character. He likes the storyline. He likes the dog. He really likes the illustrations. And, I wrote this in a style that, Kirkus' book called the style of the writing a little contrived, which I get it, like, I can see it, but it was also meant to be read to a 3-year-old. Like, I really imagine like a 3-year-old, like a 2-year-old, right, a 1-year-old as the audience. And I thought about the way in which I read books and the voices that I use. So it's really reflective of my own voice and the way that I read books and the way that I try to connect the book, to them. But I wrote it in that voice because, children are socialized, in their genders from the time that, even before they're in the womb, right? I'm thinking about, folk tales around, types of food to eat, in order to have a certain sex of a baby, or to, quell the desires, right, of a certain sex of a baby. So it starts very, very, very early. And so I thought, like, well, how can I write this in a style that connects with children that young? So even if, I can't tell that he's really connecting or getting the point, I think some of this is kind of beyond, right? The way that I'm thinking about it is kind of beyond the way that they're able to think about it. But at least it's planting seeds, right? And that was the goal of this, to plant seeds. And, illustrations, stories, they really shape the psyche and consciousness of children in ways that they don't recognize, in ways that we don't recognize, right? So we might not be able to go and say, oh, this book taught me about, this, morality in this certain way, or this, book taught me, like, not to be racist, right? It's not so much that, we're learning these direct lessons from the book, but that our psyches and our consciousness are being shaped by the multitude of messages that we're receiving through all the texts. So yeah, he hasn't really given me any, like, direct feedback about what he thinks about it, but I like that he likes the illustrations.
You've definitely planted the seed there for sure. as you're saying, it adds up. All of those references add up. I forgot to mention that as we get started here with the Q&A, I have a couple of prepared questions to ask Larissa, but we invite you to drop your question into the chat. If you can write them to Ronald as the host, and he will send those along to me for talking with Larissa. And we already have one popping in. But I wanted to follow up for just a second, Larissa, and ask you a little bit about what it meant to you as a mom to have written this book back then when you were on maternity leave, and then what has it meant to you now to still be writing as a working mom during a pandemic?
Yeah, so I wasn't on full maternity leave. I was still teaching one class. I was able to kind of cobble together the leave that we are allowed, which is 2 course releases, and also I had another like exceptional levels of service course release as well. So I was still teaching one class, but it really kind of felt like vacation to teach one class after, having been an adjunct where I taught 7 classes a semester. So it kind of felt like vacation and like a true maternity leave. But, I think about that quote by Ana Castillo, and I can't quote it verbatim, but she said something along the lines of, giving birth doesn't quell the need to create. And so, there's just something about, pregnancy and motherhood that's both extremely draining, but also I think awakens certain faculties within us. And so I think about, how people say like, oh, I get my best ideas when I'm, cleaning, when I'm sweeping, when I'm washing the dishes, when I'm, taking a shower, right? Our bodies are busy, but our minds aren't really engaged. And so our minds are left to kind of do their own thing. And I kind of felt that way with motherhood and pregnancy, right? My body was really just, being taxed, in all kinds of ways, but my mind wasn't as much, right? As little as my mind was able to function in that time of, not getting enough sleep. But I really felt, this need to keep creating and to keep writing. I took a children's book writing course with Maya Cristina Gonzalez during that time. So, that I felt for me personally, in order to feel whole, I needed to keep doing that. And I think it was also important because I think of writing as an extension of my motherhood, right? I think of, I feel like, in some ways I can improve some small part of the world through writing, whether it's through writing a children's book or editorial or a scholarly journal article. And I mean, that's just the way that I was brought up as well. Like I have lots of photocopies of letters to the editor I wrote as a teenager in high school. And I mean, that was just, I was taught that writing was really powerful and writing was a way of having a voice. And, I took advantage of those platforms that I was able to have access to, like the letters to the editor, in order to have a voice. So I feel like, in a lot of ways it's an extension of my motherhood in the way that I try to make the world a little better for my children. And just, lastly, I think, I have this concern about representation in children's books. And I wanted, as a scholar, a literary scholar, to not only, address representation from the perspective of critique, but also contribute something in order to help increase representation. So, yeah, and especially now, during a pandemic, I mean, I feel like, I don't have a lot of time, so I have to be even more strategic about, the things that I choose to invest my time into writing, but writing still very much, at the forefront of what I feel is important to do.
Thank you. So many extraordinary ideas there. The writing as an extension of self and motherhood, dedicating that time despite all these distractions to put it into something valuable. I really admire your crossing into those worlds too. I think a lot of graduate programs in English studies, you have your scholars and you have your writers, and they don't often meet. And so I love when we have real world examples of people who are successful and very good and very engaged in both. So thank you for that. Thank you for that. We do have our first question from our participants today. This comes from Jur, one of our MFA grad students. And Jur is asking, from the moment that you got the idea for the book, how long did it take you to write and revise the story? And then when you finished it, what were your experiences with trying to engage the publishing industry?
Mm-hmm. So from the moment that I submitted it to the time that I had it in my hands, it was about 2 years. And there are very wide differences in timeframes, just depending on the presses and the publisher. So like mine took 2 years, but I was just reading an article about like children's books that are already in people's hands about the virus and the pandemic and why it's important to wear masks. And so I think like Chelsea Clinton, like she, from the time that like her book idea was sold at auction to the time that it was printed, it was just a few months. So some presses are more efficient and have at their disposal illustrators, right, that are ready to go, right? They pay them really well in order to do this. And the press that I was working with, I can't really describe their size, but they are part of like this larger academic press, right? And they are more limited in their resources and their staff, but they manage to do an incredible amount, with what they have. And they have in-house illustrators as well, but that's not their sole job. They're people that they have connections with and relationships with. So I submitted my book proposal and it was actually rejected. And I submitted 2 book proposals. Maybe I'll talk about that other one in a little while. But I submitted 2, they're both rejected. And then 2 weeks later, I get an email saying, oh, we're going to accept your Esteban de Luna and we're gonna offer you the contract. So that was really surprising. And so then I started the process of working, on editing the story. They sent the story out to about 5 illustrators and they asked them to submit concepts. So then they submitted the concepts and the press decided which one to go with. I didn't have any say in that. And I think that's pretty usual. It's typical. And then they started, really, it was the illustration process that took the longest, right? Because she, that wasn't her sole job. She had her other job. And so it was the actual process of just sketching the sketches was about 6 months. And then, actually putting color on them and digitizing them, all that took, a long time. So it was about 2 years, the process. So my son was 2, right, when, when I finally got it. And, but I had a good experience with them. And I think what helped was the fact that, and I think what helped me get the contract too, was the fact that I was able to show that I had these connections to literary communities through which I would be able to promote the book. Right. And so, I might talk about this a little bit more in just a bit, but, it really is a business and we have to think about, how are we showing ourselves, to the presses or presenting ourselves in a way that shows that we will be able to help market the book and sell the book and promote it. And, what can we say about ourselves that lends us some credibility in the writing community? So I think, being that press was in Texas, I was in Texas at the time. The folks I was working with and we had a lot of mutual connections and communities. So I think all of that helped me. But after that, they did a great job considering like their staffing and resources of promoting the book. Like they sent the book out to various like awards, book competitions. I was awarded an honorable mention for the Patterson Prize, which I didn't even know existed, but it's this like competition. I think it's out of a community college actually in New Jersey, something. So I had no idea about that, but I got that honor, so it was really great. They sent it out to people who could review it. And I mean, even that's a whole conversation in and of itself, right? How people review your works. So I got a really mediocre, lukewarm review from Kirkus, but then I got a really glowing review from, oh gosh, what is it called? It's like Bilingual Books Review, and their reviews are phenomenal, and they make me look at books in brand new ways. I mean, even really pulling apart like the problems within books that are written by people of my own background, right? And showing some of the problems. So it's really interesting to see the differences and the very stark, differences in the way that books are critiqued and read. So, the book ended up on some like top 10 lists of, top 10, best diverse children's books. So that has been helpful for me. And, sadly, I haven't been able to dedicate the amount of time I think I need in order to really promote the book. So a lot of that promotion has been online and very local as well. So if I had more time and, maybe a career that was less demanding, I'd be able to better promote. And that, I think, in some ways, what's keeping me from more actively and aggressively pursuing more books, right, is the fact that, I feel like I can't maybe give the attention that I need to promoting. So I don't know if that answered your question, but those are some top of mind thoughts.
That's good. I think to extend Jer's question might be something that that you and I talked about kind of in the pre-session, is to, you mentioned that you had a couple of other manuscripts that you submitted that, that didn't get accepted. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of your failures along about this same timeline, but then also more importantly, what does that reveal about the industry? You already talked a little bit about that with how things are reviewed and, finding the reviewer who gets it versus someone who might not. But yeah, how did some of those roadblocks or failures kind of, reveal things to you about the process and the industry?
Yeah, so there were a couple of manuscripts that soon after publication, I was really aggressively pursuing and shopping around. And one of them was a manuscript that I submitted alongside Esteban de Luna. And this was one that I loved. Like it was one that I workshopped with Maya Cristina Gonzalez. I really believed in it in a lot of ways. And the story centered on a little girl whose mother is a writer. And the daughter, she talks about being lulled to sleep by her mother's typing. And, she describes her mother's desk in detail. And, she asks questions about what it means to be a writer. And, and let's just say that, ultimately, like, she comes to find some understanding of why her mother has been writing and, what that means. So she's able to, find answers to her questions. And so, I think I wrote this in a way for myself because I was struggling with some of the guilt of spending so much time, especially on my dissertation, when my children were all under 5 years old. And, I would always tell them, I'm working right now, mom's working and mom's writing. And I don't think they really understood what that meant. And so this book was meant to kind of, I guess, help me in a way come to terms with that, but also hopefully help children understand, what their parents are doing if they're in these kind of like, quote unquote, non-traditional jobs that are hard for them to understand and explain. So anyway, so all that to say, I submitted that. It was rejected, and it's just been continued to be rejected. And it makes me think about, what is considered to be representative of Chicanx children's experiences. right? I mean, it's not a common job, right? Being, and I, in that story, the mother was like an adjunct writing instructor, it's just not a common experience. And so it made me start to question, what counts, as an authentic Chicanx children's experience, right? What is considered to be authentic? And I've always kind of struggled with that as well, having, been born and raised in a place that, I think, the entire United States is still colonized, right? We still feel, those colonial vestiges, but even more so in South Texas, in this particular part that was culturally isolated in a lot of ways, and was still feeling the effects of like anti-Spanish, policies and laws. I was not taught Spanish. I had to pick up, right, from what I heard and take classes. And so that was not a part of my experience. And so, it makes me think, what is that notion that exists in publishers' minds about, what an authentic, Chicanx children's experience looks like. I've also been heavily shopping around. And when I say shopping around, I mean sending it to presses, to publishers that accept manuscripts without literary agents like representation. And also sending it to literary agents, because I'm finding that more and more presses are requiring that you already have representation in order to even read your manuscript, because they get thousands, like hundreds, or thousands of submissions, depending how big or small the press is, and depending on the, how well known that literary agent is. So this is their way of kind of, of vetting, is ensuring that, already somebody in the field has determined that this manuscript has some potential. But the other manuscript is based on Carmelita Torres, who was a teenage protester on the US-Mexico border, who led a 2-day protest in the streets to protest the new policy. I think it was in 1917 or 1918, I think 1918. It was this new policy that required that anybody crossing the US-Mexico border from Mexico into the US be sprayed, right, with chemicals, because at that time there was a typhus scare, and they were attributing the typhus outbreak to those who were crossing the border. And I don't call them immigrants, because some would just cross, because that was their job. They would come work in the United States and then come back. And so there was this typhus outbreak in Los Angeles. And at that point, they didn't really understand the way that typhus worked. And it was a communicative disease. So, you get it by being close contact with people. It wasn't really something that, was growing because of the travel back and forth across the border. So anyways, they created this, this policy, or enacted this policy that required anybody crossing over to be sprayed with these chemicals. And it was really problematic for a lot of reasons, right? There were reports of fires breaking out and people like going up in flames because of the chemicals. Women were being asked to strip their clothing, and pictures were being taken of them without their knowledge, and they were being publicly posted. And so these were all things that that Carmelita knew about, and those that were traveling with her knew about. And so they didn't want to have to be subjected to that same thing, and so they protested for 2 days. And there's actually very, very little known about this particular protest. And this teenager, she was 17 at the time, she was arrested. And so I wanted to write, I wrote a story around that. And when I first started kind of shopping it around, it was a little bit before the time that, what was it? The school shooting in, was it Parkland? School shooting in Florida. I forgot the name of the school. But we saw this rise in youth activism. And so then I revised my query letter to speak to the importance of sharing the story, right, as an example of this long, history and trajectory of youth activism. And that was especially important because, we don't have very many examples of youth activism from the 1900s, right? And from Mexican, teenagers. So I thought it was a really important, historical kind of footnote that I wanted to really, bring to public consciousness. So that continues to be rejected. And so I'm still trying to figure out, and this is where like I could really benefit from some mentorship, right, from others on how to do it. But it's so competitive. Book writing is so competitive. And the children's book world is so competitive. And the opportunities to be mentored are also very expensive. So to be part of, the Society for Children Book Writers and Illustrators, the conference is like $500, and it's like hundreds of dollars just to get your manuscript reviewed. The scholastic programs could be, they're hundreds, if not over $1,000, and then you still have to pay to get there. And so it's very, very expensive. And so there's a lot of like unacknowledged classism in children's book writing. So yeah, I learned a lot about the classism, involved in that. But there are some free resources out there. It's called Children's Authors and Illustrators, I believe, or Children's Writers and Illustrators. It's this big book that's published annually, and every year, like, they have the 2020 version, 2019, and it's full of templates for query letters, really great advice from top writers. It's like maybe $20 to $25. It's not super expensive. And then there's also one that's just about literary agents. So it has like advice from literary agents. So there is a lot of free information out there, but then there's also like that unwritten curriculum, right? Or those unspoken kind of, truths and strategies that exist that only a mentor can tell you about.
Thank you for that. I hope that book gets taken. That is a really important book. I'm glad that you have it. I want to get to a couple of the questions too that some of our participants have asked. First from Carly. She's one of our undergraduate creative writers. And Larissa, she's taken us back to the gender question. So Carly says, while writing your book from the perspective that you did you discover or have any sort of epiphanies about society regarding gender roles in children, in particular, like people who are really close to you, reactions? What were your discoveries and epiphanies around those gender roles?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to say because, I definitely approached it first as like somebody who already was very active in having these conversations, right, about gender socialization. And I have, lots of years of experience teaching intro to women's studies where we talk all about that. I have them, go into toy aisles, right, and, do analyses of that. I have them reflect upon their own gender socialization. So, my mind was already actively engaged in that. But I think, what maybe an epiphany this is a good question. It's making me think. I guess not so much an epiphany, but something I realized about myself is that like I'm still in some way, clinging to some notion of traditional gender, right? And so like, when my son was born, we called him he, right? We bought stuff that was blue. We bought things that kind of, confirm that or affirm that identity. And of course, like I tried to be as expansive as I could. But there was this idea of what having a son meant to me. And I wanted to explore and to have that different experience that I didn't have with my daughters. And, with my daughters, I was like, I just love like girl culture. I'm very girly in a lot of ways. I also grew up very like athletic and, wore athletic pants for like 3 years in high school, so, but now, I really just enjoyed that girl culture. So, we were all kind of, immersed in that for a while with 3 girls. And you know, of course, exposing them to lots of different experiences and things, but really enjoying like the bows and the dresses and all of that. And I was okay with that too. And so, you know, and now, you know, and I think, you know, one indication that tells me that, you know, I didn't socialize them in a way that they felt like they had to be that way is the fact, like one of my children is non-binary, right? And we celebrate that and support that. And, you know, another child identifies as queer. And it's just something that, you know, they felt like they could still, you know, one of them felt like, you know, she could still partake in kind of like this girl, like feminine culture, and that was not, you know, that to her, that did not mean that, you know, she was closed off to other ways of thinking, right, about identity and gender and all of that. So, but with my son, you know, I think I feel in some ways, you know, some more pressure to engage in more kind of activities around gendering and to make choices that are more traditionally gendered because of the real fear that I have, right, about the world and the world being very unkind to boys that express their gender in expansive ways. So like he has long hair, my son, he has long curly hair. Like I don't want to cut it. I love it. It's beautiful. And he loves a lot of things that are very much part of boy culture and that are very much part of girl culture. Like he has a ladybug costume with like this ladybug purse that he wears. He loves it. And he feels like a superhero in it. And so, you know, he's able to, I think, you know, still feel that freedom to choose the things that he desires and not to feel so much like, you know, that there are rules around what he can and can't have, but we're already starting to hear from him, boys do this, right? Girls do that. So yeah, I'm still trying to figure out like how to navigate that, right? How to say, you know, make it so that he doesn't feel that I am, I guess, like denying what he has perceived to be a truth, right? But then also expanding that as well. So it's hard. Yeah, I'd say that, you know, what I have found is that, you know, teaching about gender roles and socialization and actually encouraging really expansive expressions of them and, you know, parenting, and it's hard. Like it's a lot harder than just teaching about it.
For sure, for sure. We have another question, and this will probably be our last one for the session. This is from Vanessa, an undergraduate English education student in the session. And it's an extension of this, but it also connects it with culture. So Vanessa is asking, you know, in keeping with these, you know, positive explorations, positive representations, how do you find yourself navigating the issues of machismo and the strict gender roles of the Chicanx community, specifically you know, the Mexican-American community, while also embracing the culture? And that can be as an author, as a woman, as a mom, or all of those things.
Yeah, that's really hard. And I'd probably say that I find myself doing more of that thinking, not so much through the writing, just because the writing doesn't get into a lot of that, but through like the critical reading and like my scholarly work. So I feel like you know, it's in that type of writing where I am more likely to be confronted, you know, by all of that. So I really just try to, you know, take a step back and think about like, where is this coming from? You know, I try to think about, you know, I try to avoid thinking in very generalized ways and terms, right? Because, you know, machismo and expressions of that and expressions of patriarchy, I think there are different reasons for their emergence, right, in different communities and different families. So I try to recognize, you know, that there are, you know, various reasons for that, right? And so it's a really hard question. I think because, you know, it feels like, you know, we've made some headway, but at the same time, you know, there's still, seems to be, you know, very strong vestiges, right, of that machismo, and of patriarchy. And there continues to be reasons for kind of clinging to that as a way of preserving identity in a world that is trying to strip you of your culture, right? And so we talk about in my Women of Color class, there's this one article that we look at, and it's looking at Filipinas and attitudes towards sexuality. And it's looking at how Filipino families assert these expectations of sexuality on their girls that are very much like based in patriarchy, right? And they're extremely restrictive and, you know, double standards, all of that. But it's their way of preserving culture in a racist society, right? In a society that's attempting to strip them, you know, of their identity and assimilate them. So it's a preventative, like it's a defense mechanism in a way. So I try to think about like what else is going on, right, in that context that creates those, or that leads to those choices, or, you know, those ways of forming family or creating hierarchies and all of that. And I see this a lot in my students too, right, that are trying hard to really push against those traditions and push against family members, and are feeling a lot of hurt, right, in the process, because it's being interpreted as, oh, now you don't care about our family anymore, right? Or, you know, you're not grateful, right, for what we have done. And so, you know, it's hard in those moments. It's like, well, you know, we can still choose to love our families, right, while trying as much as possible to not engage in those conversations or those issues. But at the same time, as I've seen in my family, there are times when we absolutely have to engage in those conversations, because, you know, what is, you know, maybe I'm thinking about in my family, right, there's a lot of homophobia, and I have queer family members. And so in order to insist on their humanity, right, they have to confront the homophobia. So it's really hard, right? We can love the family while also separating ourselves and maintaining some distance, and protecting ourselves that way. So I think it's unique to everybody, and I try to keep in mind all the complexities and the unique circumstances, right, of each family when I think about, you know, very broad concepts such as culture and community and patriarchy.
Thank you so much for that. That's such a vulnerable answer too. I really appreciate that. We're just about out of time. I just want to take one last second to thank you, Larissa. Everyone, if you can, if you feel comfortable, you can turn your cameras on and give her a little bit of applause. I guess this is what we do now for applause in Zoom.
Yes, that's it.
You can also use your reactions. Larissa, I know we did not get a chance to talk about your two amazing anthologies, but I hope that people seek those out as well. They are really, really important additions to you know, the scholarship and the exploration of young adult Chicanx literature. So I don't know if you want to give a last shout out to where folks can obtain those.
I think our library might have, I'm all for free, if you can get them for free. And they are Rowman and Littlefield's one of the publishers, and Palgrave Macmillan's the other one. And I think they're available on Amazon as well. Mm-hmm.
Sure. Larissa, thanks again. What an incredible, vulnerable reading and discussion. We're really grateful for you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.